Thank you guys for joining us to this conversation today. I want to start just how does your organization confront the stark need we're seeing to address racial inequities in our communities? And what has this moment revealed about how you do business?
Okay, Dwayne, I thought you were going to start with an easier question, but I think what I'll say about the Whitman Institute is that the way that we are already set up, right? So we are trust-based funders in long-term relationships of learning, vulnerability and meaning and real collaboration with our partners, is that any crisis doesn't necessarily change our approach. In fact, it reinforces it. So before COVID, there were the fires in Santa Rosa that really impacted one of our partners on the move. There have been different kinds of crises, social, economic, political, natural disaster over the years that have actually just reinforced for us that the kind of grant making that we do allows folks to be flexible, responsive, resilient, shore up their own inner reserves as leaders, shore up their organizational reserves as leaders, to be able to meet pretty much a world that was complex before COVID, and that COVID I think it's COVID that revealed a lot about the stance that we in this sector take towards how to be supportive to our partners. So, I mean, not to say that we believe that we do everything well and right. It's just that this kind of partnership is really set up for the unexpected.
I would just add that, we're spending out. So we'll be closing the foundation in July of 2022. So we did, in the past year, rethink some of our plans, especially around convenings that we were thinking of in our final year. And we canceled those and shifted some of the resources we were going to be spending on that to direct support, additional support for frontline communities this past year.
And I want to come back to that whole notion of spin down and the way it affects your operation. But sticking with the moment we're in, that continues into 2021, how would you characterize the philanthropy having the stronger response that you're describing to this movement moment as a sector? What prevents foundations who haven't stepped in the way you're describing to do that?
Oh, John, I'm giving this one to you. You've been in this field much longer than me.
I think some of the issues that Pia was starting to raise around power and control, I think really get in the way of doing things differently. And I think that's what this moment is increasingly calling into question is what's going to be instructive to see this next year is even for like a case study around the pledge that was made through council and foundations. Over 800 foundations signed that, saying they were going to convert program funds to general operating support. They were going to provide funding to communities most impacted by COVID, especially communities of color, streamlining paperwork. So this kind of pledge to really do things differently. And so I think what we are going to be looking at in the year ahead is if people did what they say they were going to do. Because I think other research that CEP has done has shown there's a real gap between kind of awareness and attitudes and actually doing things differently. And I think that the big barriers to that are these issues around power and control. I think ego comes into play. I think notions of what impact means and expectations around change all get in the way of that. Because I think what we continue to see is the type of support nonprofits say they most need, which is multi-year unrestricted funding, continues to be the one type of support most foundations don't give. despite a decade and more of research and advocating for this as best practice. So I think we really need to inquire more into those barriers.
This notion of trust-based philanthropy, it's gaining currency as a foundation practice. For the uninitiated, can you briefly describe what that is?
Sometimes funding towards human dignity strips the grantees of dignity, right? So how ironic is that? So we're funding for social change, or we're funding for the dignity and self-determination of communities, and yet the processes which they have to interact with us through the portals of grant making, whatever they may be, are really not dignified, right? Strip us of humanity. Expect folks to have the second and third job of learning our language and culture and rubrics and fitting themselves into our cookie cutters that are all different between all foundations. So I think trust-based philanthropy essentially is the hope that we can change the culture of our sector to be more about these basic values for equity, collaboration, listening, taking feedback. And I think we also think of ourselves as in communities of learning and practice. So it's the role of the fellow that we're promoting here. So there are some both like actual grant making technologies that are promoted, like multi-year unrestricted funding, like streamlining paperwork, like doing the homework, as well as I think a set of attitudes and approaches to what leadership looks like. And that we are addressing actually in partnership with NCG in the ethos of trust-based philanthropy, which is trying to describe the embodied approach to grant making and relationship in this ecosystem in which power is so often afforded to the check writer. And so that's one way that I would put it. I don't know, John, if you would frame it any differently or...
No, I would just add that, for us, what we have found is to look at these practices and the values and approaches, as Pia has outlined, holistically. So in other words, we have found when you do all these things together, that's what makes this approach the most impactful. And then I would also say none of these practices are new. And we acknowledge that and acknowledge there have been people doing this for a long time, or they call it by another name. The trust-based frame came from what we heard through our own grantee perception reports from Center for Effective Philanthropy about how important it was that our grantee partners felt trusted by us. And so combined with also their urge that we heard to advocate for how we approach the work, we framed it as trust-based philanthropy. So it's really an organizing learning frame for the field that we have found an inviting one.
I want to press this just a little bit as in this moment, a trust-based approach that means long-term relationships with your grantees, and then COVID hits, and we need to pivot and be responsive. Did you find it challenging to hold the trust-based frame, even as you had to find new partners to support to respond to community need, or did it actually enable you to be more responsive?
I think the latter. And we've also always had a practice of committing, one portfolio to multi-year long-term support, and then another portfolio that's more annual and responsive. So say before even COVID, there were different threats to democracy in 2016, and we were able to do some rapid response grant making at that point. I think that our encouragement, especially as we're spending out, is not to think of things in extremes, and one of the things I like to think about or say in terms of trust-based philanthropy is that we don't believe you can be a trust-based funder without having a deep understanding and commitment to racial equity. It is, if you can't talk about power in this country without race and ableism and education and gender and class, all the identities are so wrapped up in power, in a country that was built mainly for the wealth and the protection of wealth of white male landowners. So they're interwoven for us. They express, similarly, a lot of the partners that are part of our community of learning talk about how they are doing this culture change around racial equity. The one last thing I'll say about TBP is it is a systems change and a culture change approach and effort, right? It is not a grant making technology, of which there are a ton, and you can use grant making technologies to all kinds of different ends. So we have never thought of trust-based philanthropy as a standalone institution. The reason it's a 5-year initiative is that it's meant to sort of flow into the many existing and powerful change efforts in our sector already.
I feel like you guys are at the crux of two unique or unusual positions in philanthropy. One is limited lifespan and sunsetting your resources. The other is shared leadership, co-executive directors of the Whitman Institute. Do you want to say a bit about the drivers for coming to those conclusions and what it's been like for both of you?
John, do you want to start on that one too? You were the first, so.
I would say the driver for us in terms of co-leadership was, because I'd been the full-time staff member for a long time, working with Pia in a part-time capacity for many years. And so when we made the decision to spend out in 2012 and heard through our grantee perception report this urge to advocate for what we were doing within philanthropy, we clearly saw the need for more internal capacity to make that happen. And so at that time, we decided to have Pia come on full time, and it made sense for us that if coming on to co-lead with me, and because we wanted her to have that sense of authority out in the world, we wanted to model collaborative leadership in many different ways in the organization. What quickly became apparent to me over time is, as I've talked about it, is when I gave up some of my own personal power within the organization, we became a more powerful organization. What also I think has enabled our relationship and moved us into that co-leadership in the beginning was we did have our own strong, trusting relationship. We had worked together for a long time and had mission alignment, shared values, and I would just add a final thing is what I knew internally what a great thought partner Pia had been for the past, since she had started working at the Institute. So there was also a level of acknowledgement of that thought partnership that moving into co-leadership, I think really embodied for me. And that was important.
I think of our spend out, even though we didn't have the phrase at the time, as a demonstration or expression of trust-based philanthropy. What is more trusting than not hoarding and circulating and moving the resources out from underneath us? And similarly, I think of the co-leadership model, even though again, sort of started that before the phrase existed, as an expression of a different, we wanted to do, it's culture change. And so it's countercultural to share power. It's countercultural to, have a founding executive director who could stay in the role of, having complete reign and control over this institution for its lifetime, to say both, let's spend it out, and then let's bring on someone not as a VP or not as a director of programs or director of strategy or something, but as an equal, meaning an equal voting member of the board, equal compensation and retirement packages, equal standing in the internal network and the external field. That, to me, those are all expressions of these same set of values that often only get applied to grant making, but really it's an ecosystem of relationships. How does the board relate to the staff? How does the staff relate to its grantees? How do the grantee partners relate to the communities they're accountable to? So for me, they're just natural expressions of the same set of values from which TBP has flowered. And I think it's also the push and the challenge for institutions who imagine that they can do racial equity or trust-based philanthropy without changing anything structurally. It's just not true. And you didn't ask me what wild success looked like. So beyond the polar bears and the babies of every community being happy and fat and healthy, I also, and in addition to everything that John said, I also would say that there is structural change at the leadership, executive, and board level of all of the different vehicles. So they are some foundations, some of them are donor advised funds, some of them are, there are all kinds of vehicles that resource the nonprofit sector and beyond. There's the whole, social enterprise arena, but all of those are much more diverse and collaborative than they currently exist. So that would be wild success as well, that people understand that this is about a change in our approach to doing things and a change in our approach to how we show up and be, and a structural change, because culture and structure have to change together. You can't imagine you're changing culture without changing anything at all structurally. So I think that TWI and all of our partners have really thought about what it means that who is in the decision-making role and the seats of power are also vital to the kind of culture change we all want to see.
What's been the most challenging part of changing those previous patterns of practice or behavior, or internally?
There was a journey we went on, definitely with the board. Not that individual board members so much were challenging, but that when I started, the board was definitely John's board. It was a board of trusted mentors and advisors that John had known, many of them for decades, all of whom I adored and still adore. And we had great relationships, but it really felt like there was this structural transition at the executive level. So naturally, what followed was a structural transition at the board level. And I'd say that was personally challenging for me because I haven't, as a longtime OD consultant and having different management roles in nonprofits, I hadn't necessarily ever been in the role of cultivating a board and then, being in kind of right relationship to a board. So I found that pretty challenging. And there are a lot of things I would do differently, in retrospect. I just didn't know to do differently. But we did transform the board in my tenure of almost 7 years, 6.5 years or so. We did transform the board so that is there anyone from that initial board that hired me that is even still on the board, John? I continue because
I'm the only trustee from that time. It's a completely different board.
Yeah, and the reason I think I will name it as a challenge is both my kind of learning curve around it, and also because in a traditional foundation, the board has a pretty large scale exacting control over even individual grants, and in the trust-based philanthropy kind of universe, we really encourage board setting direction, strategy, and learning relationships. But really then those budgets are then executed by the staff. And even within our board, I think there was a process around why to do that or how to do that. So like with many foundation executives, I think I will just name that board relationships and management, has been a somewhat challenging area for me personally. I don't know if John, you would share that because you had been managing boards for longer than me.
Yeah, I would say we had some different experiences around that, and probably I had more of a comfort level there. And again, though, around this issue for me, just personally, and I think this comes up with boards. So that original board, as Pia said, were people I had invited. So again, this issue of giving up some power. The current board we have, the invitation, I didn't have I wasn't the inviter for some of those people on the board. So it was also not holding on to, oh, I need to be the one making the recommendations for the board. And again, I think letting go of that, then we have a really great board, and a very brings a lot of rich perspectives to our work. And I think to underline Pia's point, with our board now, they all came in knowing we were spending out. The first board made the decision to spend out, and so it was I think some clarity for this board to be maybe helping us with strategy a little more. What do we really want to do now as we spend out? How can you help us think about that? And so they did kind of come in, and I think with the sense is, we're not asking you to be a grant making board. We want your input on strategy and communications, and and governance and things like that too. But I think being clear about the expectations and the roles, and also acknowledging, back to the point Pia made, the trust-based approach means trust is running throughout all your relationships. And so I think we're grateful that we have a board that trusts us and trusts our judgments around how the investments we've been making, and the approach, and how we work in the world.
So I saved the toughest question for last. In this incredibly intense, transformative year, how have you guys been finding joy?
Oh, that's easy for me. I have a 2-year-old. And as I mentioned previously, her favorite song is Simply the Best by Tina Turner. And she now runs up to Alexa and demands that Alexa plays that song for her. And that, along that theme, I myself have been part of choirs and gospel choirs my whole life. So I'm currently a part of the Agape International Global Choir. And we recently put together a global, like a 60-person global choir video rendition of the song Fantasy by Earth, Wind and Fire. And it's pretty fantastic. I'm happy to send you the link. And so finding joy in toddlers and singing is pretty immediate and easy. So that is one thing that's been keeping me together in 2020.
I think you may have determined our walk-on music for this interview. John, how about yourself?
Joy in the relationships in my life, my wife, my kids, my family, friends. That's a big source of joy. Our working with our partners. Nature has been a joy. Being outside. I'm fortunate enough to have a yard to work in, and I get a lot of joy from just weeding, planting, kind of creating a garden, and that's continues to be a source of joy too.
I think I have some joy for you over at my house. I might have to help you come. Well, it's been a joy to talk with both of you. We obviously could talk longer, but we know the people who will be looking at this are as busy as you are. So we appreciate you giving us this time, and look forward to your continued work. And thank you for all the influence you're having on those who are trying to advance racial equity through our philanthropy.
Thanks, Dwayne, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for your leadership.
Yeah.